Hey friend, Colin here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to show you how to mix saxophone. We're going to be looking at mixing saxophone today using EQ, compression, and reverb. And this is going to help you make sure your saxophone sits naturally inside your mix. But before we dive in here, if you're ready to go a little bit deeper into the mixing process in its entirety and really start to hone your workflow as an audio engineer, then I have just the thing for you. It is my 7-step mixing checklist, and it's just a simple PDF that will walk you through the entire mixing process step by step to help you get professional and radio-ready mixes without any more of the guesswork and without any more of the hassle. It is a completely free, 100% free to download guide, and you can get access to that by clicking the link below in the video description. Now let's jump in here and take a look at this track. You can see the saxophone solo here for the song. I'm going to back up just a touch here and take you into the saxophone solo here. So you can hear the pass on the saxophone solo, and then we'll dive into the processing on the actual instrument here. One of the first things to note here, even just visually about the saxophone, is that it looks very similar to a vocal track. If we zoom out, looking at the saxophone part here, it looks almost like a lead vocal part. The same way that if you were to zoom out and look at a bass track, it looks like a vocal part. Bass guitar, saxophone, and vocals all react very similarly inside of a track, and they require similar treatment, at least in my terms and at least in my taste here. So we're going to look at the saxophone here. I'll solo it up, and you can hear what it sounds like by itself here in terms of the finished mix. So you can hear the reverb there while it's in isolation, but once we put it inside the track, you can hear how much that reverb gets absorbed by everything else that's going on inside the mix. That's usually how reverb tends to work inside of a mix. You have to crank it up more to hear it inside of a track. I don't want to necessarily hear the reverb inside the track. I just want it there to give the saxophone some depth. So let's take off all the plugins here, and we'll start piece by piece on this saxophone. Here's our raw saxophone track as it was recorded. You can hear it doesn't sound that drastically different than our finished product because we want to keep this instrument natural sounding. It's a very natural sounding rock song. So we don't need a ton of processing on this saxophone to get it to sit inside the track. In fact, the more processing we do on an instrument like this, the less it feels natural and the less it sits right inside of a mix. So lots of little moves here. It looks like a lot of plugins, but you're going to see on each of these plugins, it's not much work going on. So the first plugin I'm using is an EQ, and I'm just rolling off the low end here before I push into compression. So take a listen here. We've got a high pass filter. That's it for this first plugin. I could have used it on the fat channel, but I like visually looking at the high pass filter as well. And I like the flexibility of the one on the Pro Q here, or the Pro EQ. We're up at 297, so almost 300 hertz here, 12 dB per octave slope. Take a listen without the high pass, and then I'll kick it in. Not making that much of a difference audibly, but you can see the frequencies that we're rolling off down below, especially with it being a live track instrument. It's mic'd up, right? Any kind of noise or rumble we have in the room, any air coming out of the instrument, it is a wind type instrument. So any air blast coming out of it, I want to roll all that off on the bottom end so we don't have any heaviness that's going to come up as we add compression or as we add reverb down the road. Next piece of the puzzle here is compression. Like I said earlier, it looks like a vocal track and it's going to react like a vocal track. So I'm going to compress it like a vocal track here using the 1176 style compressor here, the FET Comp in PreSonus Studio One. I'm running the attack at 0.55 milliseconds here, and then the release is all the way fast at 50 milliseconds. So fast attack, fast release here. I want to grab any peaks that come out, any larger volume areas, grab them, and then let go and let the rest of the saxophone part breathe. So I'm going to hit play here without the compression, and then I'll kick it in. You can hear the difference it's making tonally as well as volume-wise. You can see we're doing about 7 dB of reduction on these louder points here. These bigger peaks are getting about 7 dB of gain reduction from the compressor, but it's very fast. It kicks in, grabs these peaks, and then lets go. So any smaller sections, any quieter sections have that room to breathe and bloom up in volume to match the louder sections that we're pulling down. So we're using our compressor here to even out the volume of this saxophone because it's a solo section. So we want this saxophone to be spotlighted, we want it to stay up front, and we want it to cut through in this track. But we're also getting the added aggression of using a vintage style compressor like this. One of my favorite reasons for using the FET Comp here is that little bit of grit and that little bit of aggression it can impart on a track here. So listen one more time without it, and listen when I kick it in. We get that little bit of aggression, that little bit of grit from pushing into this unit here. It kind of brings to life that high mid area as well as the low mid area on the saxophone track. So it gets some more bite to it and it has some more weight and fullness down in the low mid area. Now, we're going to take this a step further here and we're going to pull up more of this low mid area. We got some emphasis in that high mid area from the compressor. It's got some more bite to it, but we don't want it to feel too thin. I want to bring up some of that weight. You can see I rolled off some of this area beforehand to get rid of any kind of noise or air conditioning or air blast coming out of the saxophone. But now that we have it controlled, we have it balanced, now I want to bring up some of that area because it's just going to bring weight into the saxophone part. So take a listen without, and then I'm going to kick in this boost. We're doing 4 dB at 200 hertz. So it's filling out some of the lower end of the frequency range here on the saxophone. Even visually, if we're just looking at the frequency spectrum, the heart of our sound is up here above 1K. So we're sitting around 2, 3, 4K here with most of the frequencies, and that can lead to a very thin, very prickly, harsh sort of sound for the listener. We want to add some weight on the bottom end to make sure it feels more full range and it doesn't feel small and pokey up in the high mids here. Also going to add some depth to it using the reverb here. Any kind of instrument that feels thin and feels pokey in the high mids, a little bit of reverb can go a long way to pull it back inside of a mix and make sure it feels natural sitting with the rest of the instruments. And it's not just this kind of 3 or 4K area just poking or cutting through in a track here. So I'm running usually the flat plate verb here, and then I just have it dialed up to about 6 seconds. I'm running it at about 23% here, almost 25%, usually between 20 and 25, gives me just enough of the reverb that it pulls the instrument back in the mix and gives it some depth, but you don't start to hear the tail because I don't want to hear this long 6-second tail running inside the track. I just want to pull the saxophone back and give it some depth inside of this mix. So take a listen without, and then I'll kick it in. So with instruments like this, a little bit of reverb can be your friend. I know on its own, it sounds like a ton of reverb because it's a big, long plate reverb, but only 23%. You're not going to hear that inside this track. With keyboards going, acoustic guitars, background vocals, electric guitars, drums, bass, you're not going to hear this 20% reverb on this saxophone. The last piece of the puzzle here is just rolling off some of the top end here. With a wind style instrument, the super highs can get harsh and can get brittle really fast. So just rolling off some of the super highs here. It's just a low pass at 15K here, 12 dB per octave. It's not very audible on its own or even inside the track, but just that super highs, it softens it a little bit so it's not so brittle or not so harsh of a wind sound here. Take a listen without, and then I'll kick this EQ in. Just softens the top end there, especially coming out of the reverb. Sometimes super highs don't do well pushing into a reverb, especially if we were to really crank up that reverb. So 20% reverb there, keeping it soft, and then just rolling off some of the super highs to keep it smooth up there in the top end. Let's take a listen now. Let's throw it back inside the entire track here and hear our finished product on the saxophone. That's it. So let's go back here. Let's review all of our steps that we've gone through on this saxophone. When we're tackling something that's as natural and that's as open as saxophone, we want to take small moves that keep it smooth and that keep it real and natural sounding. So a high pass filter, making sure we don't have any air blasts, anything rumbling in the bottom end, then compressing it like a vocal. So it's more of a vocal type instrument. You are of course blowing into it, a wind instrument. So compressing it like a vocal track here. Adding some bottom end so it feels full and it's not just that high mid area. Adding some reverb to soften the sound and give it some depth. And then last but not least, rolling off some of the super highs to make sure it doesn't get brittle or harsh sounding on the top end. I hope that was helpful for you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're ready to take your mixes to the next level and really start dialing in your workflow as an audio engineer, then I have just the tool for you, and it is completely free. It is my 7-step mixing checklist, and you can download it below to start creating more professional mixes in less time. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.